Some fortunes want to be seen. Others are designed to disappear. These estates weren't built to impress you. They were built to control history. In the world of inherited wealth, there exists a category that operates almost invisibly, where power is not announced, luxury is not advertised, and legacy matters more than appearance. Few families embody this quiet authority more completely than the Greek shipping dynasty, whose estates stretch across Europe and beyond, shaped not by spectacle, but by discretion, endurance, and strategic presence. Their properties were never designed to impress the public eye. They were built to last, to protect privacy, and to anchor influence across generations. Long before the family name became synonymous with global wealth, their approach to property reflected a distinctly old money philosophy. Land was not acquired for novelty or excess, but for control of geography, access, and stability. Each estate was chosen deliberately, often in locations that balanced isolation with proximity to power. From Mediterranean coastlines to secluded inland retreats, these residences formed a network of private worlds, shielded from attention yet deeply connected to political, cultural, and economic centers. One of the most defining characteristics of these estates is their restraint. Unlike modern billionaire mansions designed to showcase innovation or extravagance, these properties favored classical proportions, traditional materials, and timeless architecture. Stone, wood, and muted palettes dominated the interiors. Rooms were designed for living, not for display. Libraries were functional, not ornamental. Dining spaces prioritized intimacy over scale. Everything served a purpose, and nothing existed solely to impress. In southern Europe, the family maintained estates that blended seamlessly into the surrounding landscape. These homes often appeared understated from the outside, revealing little of their significance to anyone passing by. Gated entrances, long tree-lined drives, and carefully positioned structures ensured that privacy was preserved at every level. Inside, however, the spaces reflected refinement shaped by generations. Art collected slowly, furniture chosen for longevity, and layouts adapted over decades rather than redesigned for trends. Coastal properties played a particularly important role in the family's real estate philosophy. Access to the sea was not merely symbolic, it reflected the foundation of the family's fortune and influence. These estates were often positioned above private shorelines, offering complete seclusion while maintaining commanding views of the water. Unlike ostentatious beachfront villas, these residences favored elevation, distance, and discretion. The sea was present, but never dominating. It was a reminder of origin, not a performance. Inland estates told a different story. Surrounded by countryside, vineyards, or forested land, these properties emphasized self-sufficiency and retreat. Many functioned as operational estates rather than seasonal showpieces. Agricultural activity, staff housing, and long-term maintenance were integrated into daily life. These were places where the family could withdraw entirely, away from public scrutiny, operating within a world governed by routine, structure, and continuity. What truly separates these estates from new money luxury is how little they changed over time. Renovations were rare and conservative. When updates occurred, they were invisible. Modern systems concealed behind historic walls, comfort added without altering character. The goal was never reinvention, but preservation. Each generation inherited not only property, but responsibility, to maintain the estate's integrity and ensure it remained relevant without becoming exposed. Privacy was the most valuable feature of all. These estates were not tourist destinations, nor were they open for public fascination. Their significance lay precisely in their inaccessibility. Guests were few, carefully chosen, and often influential in their own right. Conversations held within these walls carried weight far beyond the rooms themselves. Decisions made over quiet dinners or long walks across private land shaped relationships, alliances, and fortunes. The interiors reflected this culture of control. Artwork was meaningful rather than monumental. Portraits, maritime pieces, and classical works spoke to heritage rather than taste trends. Personal items were preserved rather than replaced, reinforcing a sense of continuity that extended beyond individual lifetimes. These homes were not reset with each generation. They evolved slowly, accumulating history rather than erasing it. Staffing was equally discreet. Many employees worked across generations, creating an internal culture of loyalty and silence. Knowledge of daily routines, family habits, and estate operations was carefully contained. This stability ensured that the estates functioned smoothly without drawing attention, reinforcing the family's ability to exist almost separately from the outside world. What makes these properties particularly emblematic of old money is their relationship to power. None of the estates were isolated from influence. Whether near major capitals, cultural hubs, or strategic coastlines, each location allowed access without exposure. This balance, visibility without vulnerability, defined how the family navigated wealth. The estates were not escapes from power, but instruments of it. Over time, some properties passed quietly out of family hands, while others remained fiercely protected. Ownership decisions were guided not by sentiment alone, but by long-term positioning. If a residence no longer served its strategic or personal purpose, it was released without ceremony. If it did, it was guarded relentlessly. Emotional attachment never outweighed legacy planning. Despite global fascination with wealth, these estates resisted becoming symbols. There were no branded gates, no public narratives attached to rooms or corridors. Their stories existed internally, passed through memory rather than marketing. This absence of spectacle is precisely what preserved their mystique. The less the public saw, the more enduring the power became. Today, the influence of this old money estate philosophy remains visible. In an era of hyper-visibility and digital exposure, these properties stand as reminders of a different approach, one where wealth is quiet, permanence is valued, and privacy is non-negotiable. They demonstrate that true legacy is not built through scale or extravagance, but through consistency, discretion, and control of one's environment. Within these walls, time moves differently. Trends pass unnoticed. Attention fades. What remains is land, structure, and memory, unshaken by the noise outside. These estates were never meant to be admired. They were meant to endure. Old money has never relied on spectacle, and nowhere is that more evident than in the way wealth is structured around control rather than display. Unlike modern luxury, which often seeks validation through visibility, old money operates with an entirely different priority system. The objective is not admiration, but insulation. Power is preserved by limiting access, shaping environments, and deciding who gets close and who does not. Estates built under this philosophy were never meant to be noticed. They were meant to function quietly as instruments of long-term authority. Control begins with location. Properties were selected not for popularity or scenic novelty, but for strategic positioning. Proximity to political centers, ports, or cultural hubs was carefully balanced with physical separation. This allowed influence to remain within reach while public attention stayed at a distance. Long driveways, natural barriers, and layered security were not architectural flourishes, they were tools of separation. Every boundary reinforced the idea that entry was a privilege, not an expectation. The architecture itself reflected this mindset. Facades avoided unnecessary ornamentation, favoring proportion and durability over statement. Buildings blended into their surroundings rather than dominating them. This understated appearance served a purpose. Invisibility reduces scrutiny. When wealth is not visually provocative, it becomes easier to protect. Interiors followed the same logic. Rooms were arranged for function and control of movement, not theatrical impact. Spaces encouraged privacy, small gatherings, and contained conversations rather than open spectacle. Display invites interpretation, and interpretation invites vulnerability. Old money understands that once wealth is made visible, it becomes something others feel entitled to judge, question, or challenge. By refusing to participate in visual excess, control remains firmly with the owner. There is no performance to analyze, no message to decode. Silence becomes a shield. The less explained wealth is, the more authority it retains. Control also extends to time. These estates were not designed for rapid transformation. Change introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty weakens continuity. Renovations were rare and incremental, often invisible to the outside eye. Modern comforts were integrated discreetly, hidden behind walls and beneath floors, preserving the external identity of permanence. This resistance to reinvention reinforced the idea that the estate existed outside of fashion cycles. Trends expire, control endures. Ownership itself was structured around containment. Estates were often held through complex arrangements that prioritized continuity. Thank you over liquidity. Selling was not treated as a failure, but as a strategic decision made only when control could be preserved elsewhere. Emotional attachment never outweighed structural advantage. If a property no longer served its purpose, whether geographical, political, or personal, it was released quietly, without narrative or regret. Human presence within these spaces was equally controlled. Staff were carefully selected, often retained across generations, creating an internal ecosystem of loyalty and discretion. Knowledge was compartmentalized. No single individual understood the full scope of operations unless necessary. This internal design mirrored the architecture itself, layered, contained, and deliberate. Trust was built slowly, and silence was valued as highly as skill. Social interaction within these estates followed strict, often unspoken rules. Guests were not entertained for novelty or status signaling. Invitations were extended selectively, usually to individuals whose influence, discretion, or long-term relevance justified access. These homes were not venues for spectacle, but environments for alignment. Conversations held within them carried weight precisely because they were shielded from public exposure. Control also meant emotional discipline. Personal expression was present, but restrained. Art collections reflected heritage and continuity rather than experimentation. Furnishings were chosen for durability, not shock value. Even luxury, when present, was quiet and contextual. Nothing existed purely to provoke reaction. Every object had a reason to remain. Perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of old money is its relationship with restraint. To outsiders, the absence of display can appear modest or even conservative. In reality, it represents confidence. Only wealth that feels secure can afford to remain unseen. Display is often a response to insecurity, a need to announce arrival. Old money does not arrive, it remains. This philosophy ensures that power becomes normalized within its environment. Children raised in these estates grow up understanding access, privacy, and control as natural states rather than privileges. Wealth becomes a background condition, not a focal point. This normalization is itself a form of control, shaping perception and expectation across generations. Ultimately, control over space creates control over narrative. When wealth is not publicly explained, it cannot be publicly challenged. When estates are not visually loud, they do not invite scrutiny. When power does not perform, it does not weaken. This is the essence of old money's strength, not what is shown, but what is withheld. Old money does not measure success by how loudly it can be seen, but by how quietly it can persist across generations. The second core truth behind these estates lies in continuity, the deliberate engineering of permanence. Wealth in this tradition is not something to be enjoyed fully by one lifetime, it is something to be protected, shaped, and passed forward intact. Every decision surrounding land, property, and lifestyle is filtered through a single question: will this still work 50 years from now? Estates were designed as long-term systems rather than personal indulgences. Buildings, farmland, surrounding villages, and even local economies were often interconnected. Ownership extended beyond walls into influence. When land is held long enough, it reshapes social gravity. Generations grow up around it, employment patterns form, and institutions adapt to its presence. Over time, the estate stops being a property and becomes a constant. Continuity turns ownership into inevitability. This permanence required discipline. Unlike new wealth, which often celebrates personal taste, old money suppressed individuality in favor of stability. Renovations were conservative. Inheritance structures were carefully planned to avoid fragmentation. Multiple heirs were accounted for without allowing division to weaken the whole. Control of land remained centralized, even as family members spread across countries or industries. Time itself was treated as an asset. Long horizons reduced the urgency to monetize or modernize aggressively. Short-term profit was often sacrificed to preserve long-term leverage. An estate that could generate modest, reliable returns for a century was valued more highly than one capable of explosive growth, followed by volatility. This patience insulated families from economic cycles that disrupted more reactive fortunes. Continuity also shaped public presence. Old money estates rarely chased relevance. They allowed relevance to come to them. By maintaining consistency, they became reference points rather than participants in cultural change. When trends passed, the estate remained unchanged, quietly reinforcing its authority. Stability became its own form of influence. Family roles were defined early. Successors were raised with an understanding that ownership came with obligation, not entitlement. Education emphasized responsibility, discretion, and awareness. Legacy. Emotional attachment to property was encouraged, but never allowed to override rational stewardship. The land did not belong to the individual. The individual belonged to the land temporarily. This mindset extended into personal behavior. Public controversies were avoided not out of fear, but out of strategy. Reputation was treated as infrastructure. A damaged name could weaken the estate's long-term security, regardless of financial strength. Silence, restraint, and controlled visibility protected continuity far more effectively than aggressive defense. Marriage, alliances, and social circles were often evaluated through the lens of stability. Romantic ideals existed, but legacy considerations quietly framed outcomes. Relationships that strengthened continuity were favored over those that introduced unpredictability. The goal was not emotional drama, but structural reinforcement. Even crisis was approached with long memory. Economic downturns, political shifts, and public scrutiny were absorbed rather than resisted. Estates that had survived wars, regime changes, and market collapses did so by refusing to react impulsively. When pressure mounted, they reduced exposure, waited, and adapted slowly. Continuity thrives on patience. Cultural preservation played a critical role. Art, traditions, and rituals within these estates were not decorative, they were anchors. They reinforced identity during periods of change. Annual gatherings, inherited customs, and repeated routines created psychological continuity even when the outside world shifted dramatically. Familiarity became a stabilizing force. Importantly, continuity did not mean stagnation. Change occurred, but it was controlled and often invisible. New technologies were adopted behind old walls. Business interests evolved while the estate's external character remained intact. This balance allowed adaptation without signaling vulnerability. The true power of continuity is that it removes urgency. When time is abundant, decisions improve. There is no need to prove relevance, no pressure to extract maximum value immediately. The estate exists on its own clock, operating beyond public timelines. That independence from urgency is one of old money's most enduring advantages. Across generations, this approach compounds. Each successor inherits not just property, but a framework for decision-making. The estate becomes a teacher, shaping judgment and discipline. Over time, continuity itself becomes the asset, stronger than cash, more durable than fashion, and more resilient than reputation. Old money estates are ultimately sustained by something more subtle than architecture or land, cultural insulation. This third principle explains how influence survives not just through property, but through carefully managed distance from public emotion, trends, and volatility. While land creates physical separation and continuity manages time, cultural insulation governs perception. It determines how much of the world is allowed in and how much of the family is allowed out. These estates were never designed to be socially porous. Interaction with the outside world was intentional, selective, and purposeful. Exposure was controlled not because of fear, but because familiarity weakens mystique. When access is limited, authority grows. The estate becomes less of a place and more of an idea, one that cannot be easily defined or challenged. Cultural insulation begins with education. Children raised in these environments are taught early how to observe without reacting. Emotional restraint is not repression, but strategy. Public opinion is treated as whether, acknowledged, monitored, but never allowed to dictate internal decisions. This detachment creates a psychological buffer that protects long-term thinking from short-term outrage or praise. Media engagement is minimal by design. Attention, whether positive or negative, destabilizes control. When narratives are not actively fed, they stagnate. Silence becomes a form of narrative management. The absence of explanation invites speculation, but speculation without confirmation rarely threatens structure. By refusing to participate in cycles of commentary, these families maintain autonomy over their internal reality. Social circles reinforce insulation. Relationships are cultivated slowly, often over decades. Trust is measured not by intimacy, but by consistency. Individuals who respect boundaries remain close. Those who challenge them drift away. This natural filtration system preserves cultural alignment without confrontation. Compatibility is valued more than excitement. Traditions play a crucial role in insulation. Rituals, repeated across generations, create internal cohesion that resists external influence. When identity is rooted in inherited practice, outside trends lose their power to reshape behavior. The estate becomes a self-referential system, drawing meaning from its own history rather than from cultural approval. Language itself is part of the barrier. Conversation within these environments tends to be restrained, coded, and indirect. Direct confrontation is avoided in favor of implication and understatement. Communication style minimizes conflict and prevents emotional escalation. What is left unsaid often carries more weight than what is spoken. Cultural insulation also explains why these estates rarely pursue public admiration. Admiration creates expectation, and expectation invites obligation. Old money avoids both. By remaining culturally distant, it preserves freedom of action. Decisions can be made without concern for backlash, praise, or misunderstanding. Even philanthropy is filtered through insulation. Giving is strategic, often anonymous or institution-based, rather than personal. Causes are supported quietly, without branding or public narrative. The goal is influence, not recognition. When generosity is not publicized, it retains dignity and avoids dependency on approval. This insulation allows for long-term consistency in values. While societies undergo rapid shifts in norms and priorities, insulated environments adapt selectively. Changes are evaluated for impact, not popularity. Only those that strengthen continuity are absorbed. Everything else remains outside the walls. Critically, cultural insulation does not imply isolation. These families engage deeply with politics, finance, and culture, but on their own terms. Influence is exercised privately, where outcomes matter more than optics. Public platforms are unnecessary when private access exists. The result is a form of quiet dominance. Without competing in the public arena, insulated estates maintain leverage over it. Their absence from discourse makes them difficult to challenge, while their presence in decision-making remains intact. Cultural insulation ensures that power is not eroded by exposure. In the modern world, where visibility is often mistaken for relevance, this strategy appears counterintuitive. Yet it remains effective precisely because it resists modern incentives. By limiting cultural permeability, old money estates preserve identity, autonomy, and influence in ways that spectacle never could. Old money is not defined by what is owned, but by how ownership is protected across time. These estates were never built to compete for attention or admiration. They were constructed as systems, designed to outlast markets, moods, and generations. Land provided physical permanence, continuity ensured strategic patience, and cultural insulation guarded identity from erosion. Each element reinforced the others, creating a form of wealth that does not rise and fall with public opinion or economic cycles. While modern wealth often chases visibility, legacy wealth retreats into structure. Its power lies in restraint, in the refusal to explain itself, and in the discipline to think decades ahead rather than moments. These estates functioned as anchors, stabilizing influence through silence, distance, and deliberate control. By avoiding spectacle, they preserved authority. By limiting access, they maintained leverage. By resisting trends, they ensured survival. In the end, the greatest secret of old money is not how much it owns, but how little it reveals, and how long it lasts.